Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSTA podcast. This is Craig King, your host, and your favorite host and your favorite guest, Patrick Kelly, the one and only.
The one and only.
How you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm doing good, Craig. What I have learned over the last few weeks is the key to a successful March Madness bracket is to not be in a pool in a competition. We didn't even do one as a family this year. I just filled one out just so I'd have it. It's on paper. I had 6 out of 8 in the Elite Eight in both the men's and women's bracket. Hands down, the best performance of my life.
And you still suck.
But it doesn't matter. If a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, if you fill out a bracket and you're not in a competition, I don't know. But I feel good about it.
Yeah, I thought I'm in a bracket in a group that has like 50 people in it. And I thought at this point when I had Duke winning the men's, that would put me in the top 5, right? I am 24th.
Yeah.
Everybody picked the number 1 seed, which we have all 4 number 1 seeds. So
see, I didn't do that.
Yeah,
I didn't do that. But whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Let's get to it. But let's jump into why people actually listen to us. But I have been seeing our fans on the road. On the road, I mean 2 miles down the road at the State House when we have Legislative Hill Days.
I thought you meant you'd visited your mom's house. So. No. Sorry, I mean that's the only fan I've got. So.
Shout out to Mom. That's probably the consistent fan that I have as well. But no, we have tons of fans out there.
Okay, Patrick. Okay. Well, we appreciate them.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into it, Patrick. So the Educator Assistance Act.
Yes.
Last week it was in full Senate last week.
Full Senate Education Committee.
So tell me about where we are with that.
So last week on Wednesday, for the first time ever, the Educator Assistance Act got a hearing before the full Senate Education Committee. That's a big deal. That's another step forward in the legislative process. The bill got extensive discussion. It was probably the bill that was most discussed on the agenda last week. It did not advance, though. The Senate Education Committee, upon the motion of Chairman Greg Hembry, moved to carry over the bill.
But that's normal. That's normal.
It's normal, and what's important is it doesn't kill it.
Right.
Carrying over is not killing a bill. It is simply delaying a final vote as the Senate works through amendments. And in the committee process, especially for a big bill for the first time, it is typical for them to take 1, 2, 3 committee hearings to get through it. And they had some good discussion on Wednesday. There were some amendments that were offered to strengthen it. A notable one, Senator Michael Johnson from up in York County wants the bill to be amended to not just modify the breach of contract statute in the way that the existing bill does. He wants to make it point blank impossible to go after a teacher's contract for breach of contract if they have a, quote, bona fide change of residence to a non-contiguous county. So in his mind's eye, if you're willing to pick up and move in the middle of the school year, you're probably not doing that just because of a job opportunity in teaching. It's not like the pay discrepancy is that significant across districts in most cases. You're probably moving because of a spouse, because of a family member.
Right.
They've got some significant amendments, but because of that, they carried it forward. They've already announced another meeting on April 8th, and so that Educator Assistance Act is on the agenda for that meeting, and so it should be good to hopefully move forward at that point, but it's good to see it on the agenda again. That's just another step forward.
Well, yeah, Patrick, and I'm glad you noted that that's the normal process because we expect the Senate to have some ideas about ways they want to strengthen the bill. And so we'll keep you posted on that as it moves forward. The expulsion bill.
Yeah, so S-416 was also on that full Education Committee docket last week with the Educator Assistance Act. This is a bill that was introduced by Senator Hembry and Senate President Thomas Alexander, and it deals with the part of state statute that requires the expulsion of a student that has a firearm on a school campus. And so it's really seeking to update that statute in 2 ways. Number one, it's trying to clarify that the mandatory expulsion is only the result of a student knowingly having a weapon on campus. And so there's been a lot of discussion about, well, what does it mean to knowingly have a gun? But it came out that the heartbeat behind this is instances, and this is not unheard of in South Carolina, that somebody went hunting over the weekend. They forgot that the gun was in the trunk. And they showed up on campus. And so, does that rise to the level of a mandatory 12-month expulsion from school? Some senators think it probably shouldn't, so they're playing with the word knowingly. The other thing that the bill as introduced does most significantly is it tries to clarify that mandatory expulsion decision must flow through the school board, not through the superintendent. Because as was explained in committee, this is such a grave and serious behavioral action at school that the ultimate decision should rest with the elected board of the district, not with the superintendent.
Yeah.
So that's what the bill said. Now, PSTA, we submitted an amendment on it. And so that amendment has generated quite a bit of conversation as well. And what we recommended, we support what the bill seeks to do in terms of the expulsion process, but we recommended that if they're going to open up this part of state statute, they should also address the growing impact of threats of firearm use on campus.
Absolutely, which we see quite frequently.
Yeah, I mean, going back 3 years ago when coast to mountains, we had schools across the state shut down on one day because of a active shooter hoax that swept the state, and literally thousands of local law enforcement officers were deployed on the same day. And since then, it seems like we can't go a month in this state without at least one school having to shut down for the day because somebody goes on social media and pops off that they're going to do something with a weapon, usually very specific about it, like not just back in the 20th century, when I was a student, somebody get frustrated and they might say something.
Yeah.
But that's a different beast when you do it on social media and it's broadcast to everyone and it's deliberative and it's premeditated and it's specific. And so our recommendation was that if they're going to deal with this part of code, they should look at this issue as well. Of course, a student who makes a threat right now against a school on social media can face expulsion, but it's not spelled out in state code. It's also not spelled out in state board regulations. State board regulations talks about bomb threats. I mean, that was a 20th century kind of thing, phone in the bomb threat, but it doesn't talk about social media threats and threats of using a firearm in the way that we see right now happening. So our recommendation is simply, if you're going to open the code, address this issue as well, to make it clear for districts that this is a serious issue that requires significant disciplinary action, but B, to also send a message and make it clear that this is something that students should not take in a light and frivolous fashion. We've heard that from our district superintendents. We've heard that from our local law enforcement officers, our sheriffs. We think we should hear it from our legislature as well.
For sure, that clarity and clarification on some of the issues that are current and not necessarily assuming that the way something was written in code years ago would apply today, because as we know with the law, we need to be clear.
Yeah, and to be clear, like our heartbeat, and I said this in testimony, it's been in written feedback, it's important here to strike the right balance between ensuring that every child has access to the education that they're entitled to, and balancing that against the right of every other child to go to school free of fear, and for parents and families to send their kid to school free of fear. So the way that we have discussed this with legislators is not, it needs to be more nuanced, and it needs to be more defined in code than just, if I say a threat, then I'm automatically expelled. The heartbeat here is not that some fourth grader who's frustrated and blurts out, "I'm going to hurt you," automatically gets expelled. That's not it at all. In fact, we specifically said it needs to be something that is communicated in writing or through digital communications, not just a impulsive statement that's shouted out, but it needs to be specific, directed at specific individuals, that there's a reasonable expectation that bodily harm could come from that it disrupts school in the way that it shuts school down or parents won't send their kids to school. So we're trying to be really specific here, but we think that anything that rises to that level is significant enough that it should be addressed in state law.
Well, that's good to know. And we'll keep an eye on that, guys, and communicate when any changes happen in the movement of that bill. So, Patrick, it's been a couple weeks since the House did their work on the budget. When do we expect the Senate to take their first shot at the budget?
Yeah, so we're recording this Monday, March 31st. On Wednesday, April the 2nd, the Senate K-12 Finance Subcommittee will meet for potentially their final time. They've also scheduled to meet on Thursday, but they may or may not need it, depending on how Wednesday goes. But on Wednesday, they will review provisos. So those are the one-year policy statements in the state budget. They'll be looking at the provisos that came over from the House. They can amend those. They can remove those. And this is the chance for members of the subcommittee to also introduce their own new provisos if they have any. Then next week, the week of April 8th, the Senate will be in perfunctory session, which is just a fancy way of saying the full Senate will not meet on the floor for debate. Committee hearings will still happen.
I like perfunctory.
Perfunctory is a great word. We don't use it enough. Let's find more ways to use that around the office. I don't know how we do that. We can leave a voicemail.
I'm going to be in a perfunctory session next week at work.
Yeah.
I won't physically be here, but something will be happening. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're a podcast listener and you call and get a message, or you get a message on an email that says I'm in perfunctory session, you get the inside joke.
That is totally my next vacation response, Patrick. I love it.
So that while they're on perfunctory session, they will still be working. Committees will be meeting. Like I said, the Education Committee is going to meet on Tuesday to deal with the Educator Assistance Act and some other bills. But the reason they're in perfunctory session is to give the Senate Finance Committee more time and space to hold their meetings. So next week, they will be meeting to take up the budget in full, with an eye toward, by Thursday, April 10th, the Finance Committee reporting out their version of the budget to the full Senate, which would then take up the full budget as reported by Senate Finance in another 2 weeks. So next week, we're going to get the first snapshot of what does the Senate do with the House budget. Do they add funding in areas? Do they remove funding in areas?
Do we anticipate them to have an updated outlook from fiscal affairs?
They got that last week. There was no real upward projection in revenue. So they seem to be working from the same amount of revenue growth that the House was working from.
Okay. Good to know. All right, Patrick. A lot of buzz on the U.S. Department of Education and the likelihood or the possibility of that being dissolved. We've heard from members. In our Hill Days and other entities in the work that we do. So what can you share about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things that is just really confusing and full of hot takes that are really off the mark and in the media and social media because it's confusing. I don't think it's because of malintent. I just think there's a lot of moving pieces here. About 2 weeks ago now, President Trump signed an executive order that the title of it's about dissolving the U.S. Department of Education. So if you read the title, you think, oh, well, that means the end of the Department of Education. But the text of the order specifically notes that the secretary should work toward winding down the department to the extent that the law allows. And so that's an acknowledgement that the department exists in law. There's a 1979 law that says there shall be a U.S. Department of Education. So an executive order cannot override that law. An executive order is to faithfully execute the law, not to reverse the law. Only Congress can do that. And in Congress, in order for an agency to be eliminated that exists in statute, it would have to proceed through ordinary legislation. And so that's a dorky government way of saying there are certain types of bills that the U.S. Congress can take up by simple majority vote. One that a lot of people are probably going to learn about over the next few weeks is what's called a reconciliation package, which is a budgetary procedure that will be most likely used for tax cuts that will be passed by Congress. They just need 51% of the House and the Senate. But for ordinary legislation, the rules of the U.S. Senate require 60 votes to close debate on a bill, to do what's called invoke cloture. Right now, there are 53 Republicans in the Senate, 45 Democrats and 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats. That's not 60.
Right.
And so even if a bill is introduced in Congress to eliminate the department, which I think there already has been a bill introduced, if not, it's coming. The chair of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee has stated he's going to introduce the bill. But you're going to need 60 votes, and that requires 7 Democrats or some mixture of Democrats and independents that total 7 to get you to 60, and that's assuming all the Republicans stay together, which that hasn't happened. I mean, there were Republicans that voted against some of President Trump's cabinet nominations. So it would appear that legislatively it's unlikely that the department's going anywhere anytime soon, but that doesn't mean that the department cannot be fundamentally restructured and overhauled by the administration, and they're doing that. We've already talked about on this podcast, they've laid off about 50% of the department's workforce. The president has floated moving core programs like the federal student loan portfolio that is at the department. He's talked about moving that to the Small Business Administration. But again, that's not as simple as just moving it, because the law says student loans shall be housed at the U.S. Department of Education. So to move it, you got to change the law. Right. And again, that requires 60 votes in the Senate, unless the Senate wants to change their rules and get rid of the 60 vote threshold. But that gets bigger than education. And the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune from out in the Dakotas, has made it clear he doesn't want to get rid of the filibuster, which is what the 60 vote threshold is designed to end, largely because he might be the minority leader one day, and he would like to have that tool available.
Right.
So all that to say, it's like Mark Twain saying that my death has been greatly exaggerated, or whatever the Twain quote is. The department's death has been greatly over-exaggerated, but is the department fundamentally changing? Yes,
absolutely.
It is.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate that, Patrick, that explanation, because it kind of outlines what is allowable by law and things that are in statute that have to be changed with Congress's input. So I appreciate you sharing that. Anything else you want to add for the good of the order?
No, sir.
All right. Well, this week we have quite a few Hill Days. We have tomorrow on April 1st, Richland School District 2 Teacher Forum. Wednesday we have Lexington 2, and Thursday we have a joint Hill Day with Florence 3 and 5. So we're looking forward to those teacher leaders impacting education from a policy standpoint, engaging with their elected officials. It's been another impactful episode of PSTA Podcast. I'm Craig King, your host, and I hope your brackets fare much better than mine and Patrick's. See you next time.